Okay, and perfect. So, hello and good evening to you all. Thank you for joining us today and being a part of this conversation on our criminal justice system and the ways it impacts our society. I'm grateful to everyone for taking the time to be here, and especially grateful to our expert panelists who have agreed to share their valuable perspectives with us all. My name is Dwayne Norris, and I will be your host and moderator for this evening's panel conversation. I am the co-founder of Soulful Synergy, a community activist, organizer, and a proud member of the Rotary Club of Harlem, where I serve as the Director of Community Outreach and Engagement. Soulful Synergy is a full-service, minority-owned, socially conscious consulting company that takes a multifaceted approach to sustainability, workforce, and community development. Our goal is to empower people, organizations, and communities to thrive by connecting them to opportunities that maximize the resources available to them. And Rotary International, for those of you who are not familiar, is the world's largest service organization. We seek to address local and global issues through a community service approach. We have a little over 1.3 million members that are across the globe, with over 35,000 clubs in over 200 countries, who combat issues such as promoting peace, fighting disease, providing clean water, aiding mothers and children, supporting education, and growing local economies. And while criminal justice reform is not our normal area of focus through Rotary or through Soulful Synergy, and I'm certainly no expert, but we believe is an integral part of how we seek to improve communities across this country. This is not a time to sit idly by, but a time to engage in difficult conversations and self-reflection. And when we saw the civil unrest taking place around the country, we got involved through protests and community engagement. But one thing that we really wanted to do better was educate ourselves on the issues and to really understand what we were witnessing and why the level of outrage was so loud. You really have to research and study to see all the ways in which this country has committed acts of injustice against Black and brown and marginalized communities. What we are seeing is decades of frustration due to unfair treatment, oftentimes imposed by the very systems that are supposed to protect us, or at least they claim to do so. Police brutality is being shown through videos in increasing numbers, and the footage has been very disheartening and disturbing. We also have to understand that the police enforce laws on behalf of a larger institution, and that is our criminal justice system. Police misconduct is only a part of a larger issue that has created unjust, unfair, and unacceptable outcomes for many minorities in this country. And in order to better understand the connection between the system of policing and our criminal justice system, I reached out to my network of legal professionals to get their take on the subject. The education they provided me over several hours of phone calls and back and forth communication opened my eyes in a pretty powerful way. And I thoroughly believe this information is something that a lot of Americans don't know either. So I'm proud to have the opportunity to introduce to you all an expert panel. And I'm equally proud to know each of these individuals as advocates for truth, fairness, equity, and justice. They have spent decades working in the criminal justice system and are intimately familiar with its issues, flaws, and shortcomings. As you can see, 3 of them are white, and I really wanted to get the perspective of people who are not directly linked to any Black Lives Matter movement. None of the people on this call have any personal agenda other than seeing the improvement of our systems and the goal of living up to our Constitution and ensuring justice for all. And so criminal justice reform is a very large and comprehensive issue to tackle, and we will not be able to cover all aspects of it this evening. We'll be focusing mostly on the prosecutorial and adversarial aspects of our justice system, and how those in positions of power impose harsh and oftentimes unfair sentences to our communities of color. As you can tell, the title of this conversation is quite provocative. Abuse of power, a systemic injustice, is meant to stir up a little bit of feeling, and that was done intentionally. I believe that power comes with great responsibility, and when you leverage power against those who have the least ability and resources to defend themselves, it is considered injustice and an abuse of authority. We are living in an era where our systems have become or have been used to inflict harsher sentences and punishment on harm on communities that don't have the political power, economic power, or legislative power to fight back. And that's what needs to change. So I want to thank our partners at Rotary District 7230 here in New York for providing us this platform through Zoom to communicate with you all and to address these issues. I want to thank the Rotary Club of Harlem, my home club, for all their support, the amazing club that I have. The Rotary Club of Bronxville, where George is a member, and they've been extremely helpful throughout this entire COVID time and this time of civil unrest. And my team at Soulful Synergy, my best friend and business partner, Alejandro Alvarez, and our business development manager, Lily. Great team that we have that have helped us put this entire program together for you all. And so it's my pleasure to introduce to you what I consider to be an expert panel, and really want to share with you some folks that I know are going to educate you guys in a very important way. So I'm going to share my screen if you give me just a half a second, and run through some bios with you. So first off, we have a good friend, Thomas Mirigliano, the founder and the managing attorney at the law office of Thomas S. Mirigliano, Esquire, PC. Thomas is a highly regarded trial lawyer handling both criminal and civil cases. Operating out of his firm's office in New York City, he represents clients throughout the greater metropolitan area, including parts of New Jersey. Mr. Mirigliano has been admitted to practice before all New York and New Jersey state courts since 2012. In his criminal defense practice, he provides forceful advocacy to people who have been accused by the state or federal government of having committed misdemeanor or felony offenses. These types of cases that he has had experience in handling have included driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs, assault and battery, drug possession and distribution, violent crimes, and fraud and other white-collar crimes. Mr. Mirigliano has been able to obtain positive results for his clients, both in the courtroom after acquittals or dismissals, and outside the court through negotiation of favorable plea agreements with state and federal prosecutors. Tom has a civil rights practice as well, in which he has represented victims of wrongful arrest, police misconduct, or brutality, and since 1981 discrimination violations. That's Section 1981 discrimination violations. His litigation experience has also encompassed breach of contract actions and a wide variety of commercial disputes. And I will back up his civil rights because he always messages me and says, if you know anybody who's out protesting who needs a defense attorney pro bono, let me know. And so I do appreciate Tom and for all of his support. Eliza Orleans, New York City Public Defender and Manhattan District Attorney candidate. Eliza is a Manhattan public defender and outspoken advocate for our city's most vulnerable. For more than a decade, she has represented over 3,000 New Yorkers who would otherwise not have been able to afford a lawyer. During this time, Eliza has developed a reputation as a relentless champion for the underdog. She has taken on the toughest of fights for the very people our system is rigged against, including our Black and brown communities and those in lower income communities. In 2020, Eliza announced her candidacy for Manhattan DA with a platform designed to transform criminal justice and make New York safer for everyone. Time and again, Eliza has demonstrated the courage and tenacity to take on powerful entrenched interests, including District Attorney Cy Vance and his cronies, to prevent moms and dads from being thrown in cages for offenses as petty as putting a bag of groceries on an extra seat in the subway. As a criminal defense attorney for the Legal Aid Society, Eliza has litigated both New York State Supreme Court and New York State Criminal Court. She also trains new lawyers to argue for bail, win suppression hearings, and cross-examine witnesses and compose closing arguments. Rotarian from the Bronxville Club and Judge George McInnes retired from the Bronxville Justice Court in April of 2018 after 24 years on the bench. He is rated AV by the Martindale-Hubbell Law Directory, which is the highest rating given for professional skills and ethics. Based on his 20 years of experience as a justice with criminal jurisdiction, whose principal remedy to criminal behavior has been incarceration and probation, Judge McInnes has concluded that those who are sent to prison and or probation tend to be rearrested, and additional crimes that the more times that a defendant has been incarcerated in the past, the more dangerous and violent are his or her crimes after each incarceration. So Judge McInnes has concluded, based on criminal law experience, that there is a need for society to do the following things in revision of our criminal justice system. Remove incarcerations as a remedy for appropriate nonviolent crimes, remove statutory minimum sentences of incarceration, and allow the sitting justice the freedom to craft a sentence that meets the circumstances of a case and the needs of the society. Establish a court-supervised system in which criminal defendants are not hardened recidivists, may be ordered by the court to go through a series of therapies and interventions which are calculated to change the defendant's behavior for the long term. And last but not least, Dr. Mena Demesi is the Vice President of Policy Analysis and Research at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation in DC. She leads the foundation's research and policy initiatives that affect African Americans and the global community in areas around education, criminal justice, economic opportunity, voting, and environmental sustainability, among many others. In her capacity, Dr. DeMessi has spearheaded several partnerships with the White House, Congress, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and other nonprofit stakeholders to advance strategic efforts to influence and inform public policy. Prior to joining the CBCF, Dr. DeMessi was one of 5 scholars in the United States to receive the prestigious American Political Science Congressional Fellowship. For the fellowship, she joined Congresswoman Barbara Lee's team to work on federal unemployment legislation, anti-poverty initiatives, and foreign affairs in the 112th Congress. She is the founder and co-managing editor of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's Journal of the Center of Policy Analysis and Research, a multidisciplinary peer-reviewed journal on the public policies related to Black politics in the United States and abroad. Dr. DeMessi is also the founder of the CBCF's first editorial board, an initiative she facilitated in honor of Dr. Ronald Walter's legacy of advancing and engaging scholarship in the overall mission of the CBCF. And recently, she founded, with her partners, the National Racial Equity Initiative for Social Justice, which is also a scholarship opportunity. And Dr. DeMessi has interviewed with NPR and other media outlets. And as you can see, she is quite skilled in the piano and spoken word. And we are blessed to have this amazing team. I don't know how I got quite so lucky to, stack the deck in our favor for this discussion. But what I'm excited about is that it is a dynamic discussion, that you have a variety of voices with a variety of different perspectives. And we're going to start off and lead off tonight with Thomas, who's going to give us a little overview about what he experiences in his role as a defense attorney, how he sees his role in relation to police and the court system. So Tom, come off of mute and take it away, my friend. Off of mute.
Unmute. There you go.
There you go.
I knew I'd have that problem. Thank you. I appreciate you having me here. Hello, and thank you to everyone who's out there listening. One of the things in my career that I've seen, and what made me get into what I wanted to do, which was defend people's civil rights, is violations of civil rights. I started my career about 10 years ago as a criminal defense attorney in Newark, New Jersey. And anyone who knows about Newark, New Jersey, it's a relatively small city, if we, when we compare it to New York City. But it has a high per capita crime rate, especially violent crimes. I was lucky enough to work with someone who gave me the opportunity to really have a lot of autonomy and handle cases the way I wanted to handle them. And I'll admit, in the beginning, I was certainly wide-eyed and bushy-tailed. I don't know if that's how that saying goes, but that's how I was. I thought that I can change the world. I still do. But immediately when I started getting involved in criminal defense and I saw how corrupt the system was, how everyone unfortunately is in cahoots, starting with the prosecutors, then the judges, and really just the system itself, the way it's structured, I realized that it was going to take a lot more than just my ambition to change things. I have to admit, I was also very disheartened in the beginning. And so as I kept going and I kept fighting, because that's just who I am, I scored a couple of victories. And frankly, those victories earlier on in my career is what kept me going. So I know things can be done. So that's just a little bit about me. In Newark, I saw a lot of civil rights violations. I know that this is maybe something that people know about or have heard about, but test the line by the police. It happens so much. It is so rampant throughout the criminal justice system that if you don't stay focused, if you're in my position, you don't stay focused, it's extremely easy to become disheartened. Because if a police officer gets up on the stand and says that your client was adjusting his waistband and he saw the outline of something sticking out of his waistband, that gave the police probable cause to search him. And of course, they find a gun and that person is arrested. Now you have to deal with that. The truth is, 9 out of 10 times, that's not really what happens. The police did not see that. They had no idea what this person had on them. All they did was go up to someone who, with a hunch, in their opinion, based on absolutely nothing other than who that person was, what they look like, that they might have something on them. And unfortunately, a lot of times that person might have some kind of contraband on them that the police will arrest them for. But that is not constitutional. I don't want to get too much into the legal specifics, but it is not constitutional to just stop someone in the street and, shake a tree, so to speak, because that's what they do. So again, over time, I've learned that it's something that you have to deal with, but you are able to score victories in certain instances. I also wanted to focus on the business side of policing. There's a thing called CompStat that the police have been using since probably about the 90s. It's modeled after the broken windows theory of policing, which is that if you crack down on minor crimes, you'll ultimately reduce more serious crimes. There are studies that say that it does reduce crime. In my view, it doesn't reduce crime enough to put people in a position where you're making criminals out of people who are in the street just making mistakes most of the time. And that's what the broken windows theory does. But CompStat is related to that in some way, because the way it started was in New York City, they would put pins in the map of where the crime was occurring. And over time, those pins, you would have a lot more pins concentrated in one area. And so they said, all right, we're going to send more police over there because that's where most of the crime is happening. So over time, they've concentrated police officers in those areas, and theoretically, it reduced crime. But what has happened, because with innovation, technological innovation and things like that, what has happened is that these statistics that were developed through CompStat have been used in perverted ways, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is that the police not only have altered the statistics to try to make it more PR friendly, but certain law enforcement agencies have altered statistics, crime statistics, in order to get more funding from either the state or federal government. And that kind of perversion of the system is totally antithetical to the Constitution, totally against what the criminal justice system is supposed to stand for. One thing I do believe in is the Constitution, and I do believe that if implemented in practice the way it's supposed to be, I think that we would have more justice than injustice. Unfortunately, it becomes perverted by things like CompStat, right, which is used to essentially address problems that, yes, exist, but I think become exacerbated when you have, and just so to clarify, what happens is the police then concentrate more officers in one area. And when you have more officers in one area, yes, it may reduce crime, but it also creates an us versus them mentality. And so the people in the communities that have high concentrations of police, they will then see the police as being an enemy. And since the 1980s, that's been exacerbated by the militarization of police. There's a program called the 1033 program, and the 1033 program is a program that is done by the Department of Defense, and it sells, well, it doesn't sell, but it gives equipment, military equipment, to local law enforcement agencies, and local law enforcement agencies have this now paramilitary style of policing, which makes that high concentration of police officers in one area much, much worse. Because, like I said before, when there's a lot of police officers essentially coming to, promote law and order, well, if they come and do that with grenade launchers, with military aircraft, with night vision goggles, it becomes something totally different. And unfortunately, over time, I think there are generations of children, especially in Black and brown communities, that have been living in really a de facto war zone. And that is something that has been created by things like CompStat, using those statistics to try to concentrate police and the militarization of the police. So those things right there are very, very, very bad for criminal justice and very, very bad for justice in general. I'm a private attorney. People pay me to focus on their case. That's what you pay me for. Unfortunately, most people can't afford to hire a lawyer like me. So they get stuck in the system where they are assigned a legal aid, like Eliza, and I say this with all due respect, who most of the time have caseloads in the hundreds. And it is impossible for them to commit the kind of time and resources that they need to all of these cases. And it becomes an injustice. So the biggest problem right now is militarization of the police and the inability of people to get a good defense and proper due process because of the lack of financial resources that most of the people who have these high concentrations of police in their areas, who are out there just simply looking for crime because they've been told by their superiors that this is where all the crime occurs. And it's just a vicious cycle that goes over and over again. So it's something that I see every day. It's something that I will continue to fight against. And I will devote my entire life to that.
That is a perfect entry into what is going to be another set of educational panelists. So thank you so much, Tom. And maybe I didn't give the proper format to everyone, but I do want to say each of our presenters is going to get about 10 minutes to share their perspective because each of them is intimately involved with this system in some way, shape, or form, and they want to be able to, I want to give them enough time to share perspective, and then we're going to follow up with some Q&A after. And so next up we have Eliza Orleans, district attorney candidate and New York City public defender. And she can speak to some of the caseloads that Tom just mentioned, as well as some of the other things that she has seen with respect to the system. So Eliza, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dwayne. Thank you for having me. And thank you to all these wonderful attendees. I'm just so happy to see that there are so many people who care so deeply about this really, really critical issue. I have spent my career as a public defender. I became a public defender about 11 years ago, and I saw our cruel, unjust criminal legal system operate. And I was angry and frustrated and heartbroken. And I remember when I was a public defender, my first year, I walked into night court where I met a man who I will call John, who was an assistant manager at a Gristedes, which is a supermarket in New York City. And he'd worked at the same grocery store for his entire life. I mean, his entire adult life, probably over 20 years at the same Gristedes. And he had closed up the store and bought 2 bags of groceries with his employee discount to bring home to his family. He got on the subway to head home, and he placed his groceries on the seats next to him in the uncrowded subway car. At the 125th Street stop, 2 uniformed NYPD officers got on the train, they grabbed his groceries, dumped them to the ground, and placed John in handcuffs, and then proceeded to take him to jail for the night for the crime of occupying multiple seats on a transit facility. Now, I met him the next night. I was working night court, as we public defenders do, and I got him out of jail, but for 10 years, that frustration and heartbreak and anger has never gone away. Because in a decade of defending human beings, these are mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, these are people's children, people who couldn't afford to hire an attorney, people being jailed and bullied for as little as taking up 2 seats on the subway. I've come up against time and time again a system that's designed to systematically disenfranchise so many. Black and brown people, lower income people, victims of sex crimes, the non-powerful and disconnected. I think you'll often hear people say, oh, our criminal justice system is broken. But I push back on that and I say the system is not broken. In fact, it's working exactly as designed, exactly the way a rigged system is supposed to, and disenfranchising the very people it was designed to disenfranchise. And meanwhile, protecting the wealthy, well-connected, powerful, and often white, while marginalizing already marginalized communities of color. And for more years than I can count, the prime beneficiaries of this have been the rich and powerful and well-connected. And it's really not a coincidence, because here in New York, the system is run and implemented by an elite, entrenched politician. And so that's what we get out of it. And so for over 10 years, I've worked as a public defender here in Manhattan. I've stood side by side representing more than 3,000 people, fighting for human beings in this city, and really recognizing that we don't have a system of justice. We have a criminal legal system that is cruel and unjust and does not keep us safe. And after spending over 10 years challenging the Manhattan DA, Cy Vance, and his office in the courtroom, I realized that we can't change the system unless we change the DA, which is what led to my decision to run for Manhattan District Attorney. And Cy Vance has perpetuated this lock 'em up, throw away the key mentality, which does not keep us safe. In fact, the data shows that if someone's locked up for whether it be 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, or even just 3 days, that person is exponentially more likely to reoffend or get rearrested. And the DA's office doesn't treat people as though they're people. They're case numbers, they're inmates, felons, criminals. It's dehumanizing at every level. And district attorneys have such a huge outsized impact on how the criminal legal system operates. I know that there are people joining from across the country, but in America, there are 2.3 million Americans incarcerated, and thousands of which are in New York City jails. But most of the people in this country who are incarcerated are there pre-trial, meaning they are presumed innocent. Presumed innocent until proven guilty, you hear, not yet convicted of anything. But these people are often just too poor to afford to buy their freedom. So when Thomas talks about the lack of resources leading to worse outcomes in cases, he's 100% right. And I've seen it time and time again as a public defender. And cash bail perpetuates the biased and racist nature of our system. People of color are more likely to be held pre-trial, receive higher bail amounts, and therefore be forced into longer sentences and coerced plea deals. And I think what we're all starting to realize and call out is that we need bold transformational change. The system is racist. And to change the system, we have to change the DA. And I think that in this moment, we are really seeing an amazing thing where we're in this historical moment in time, which, is horrible and dark in so many ways, but also is hopeful. And I think that that it oftentimes takes protest or the conscience of the country to be rocked in order to create like massive change across the nation. And I think that people have had enough. They've had enough, and they've recognized that right now it's not enough to just have people say, oh, well, I'm not racist. No, you must be actively anti-racist, which means you must be intentional, deliberate, and unapologetic in your fight to dismantle structural racism and systemic oppression, and not being afraid to call out white supremacy. And as Dwayne says, we're white. There are white people here tonight, and we're still calling it out, using our privilege, using it in a tangible way. And I think that there are some who say, oh, well, I vote, or well, I live in a blue state. But those things are not enough, because first of all, not all Democrats are created equal. And second of all, there are people who have systematically had their voices taken away by the system. They've been disenfranchised in order to perpetuate the system. And so I think it's time for white allies to step forward, to shout out loud that Black Lives Matter, and that we are incredibly committed to making this change across the board and truly working to dismantle our criminal punishment bureaucracy. And so thanks for having me, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Thank you, Eliza. Burn down the system. I'm never against that approach. I do understand that there's going to be a variety of different perspectives here, that some believe the system is not broken, that it's built the way it's built and is doing exactly what it's doing, and some believe in reform. We have that ability to have this conversation tonight. and really get these varied perspectives. And so I'm super excited for the rest of this conversation. And believe me, I got some follow-up questions for you. So thank you so much. Next up, we have a good friend, George McGinnis. As I said, George is a retired judge, so he also has technically no reason to even have to engage in this stuff. He could be relaxing in Bronxville, and he's chosen to share his perspective on what he viewed in his 24 years on the bench and some of the things that he felt like could have been done better, differently, to create more just and more favorable outcomes. And so if our goal as a justice system is to create justice, create a better society, a more peaceful society, what role are judges playing in that, and what can we do? So George, I look forward to hearing from you, and go ahead and take it away, my friend.
Thank you very much. I spent 24 years on the bench. Prior to being on the bench, and while I was on the bench, it's a part-time work. And after I was off the bench, my normal practice was doing high technology startups as a promoter and as a lawyer. So when I got into this 24 years of being a village justice, I had absolutely no experience in criminal law. Nothing I'd ever done as a lawyer had anything to do with it. It was simply a community service at that time. The New York Justice Courts have far more jurisdiction than justice courts in other states. In other states, they're merely traffic courts. Our justice courts, in addition to other jurisdiction, have criminal jurisdiction through a Class A misdemeanor, and our justices can give sentences up to 1 year in prison. Now, it should be obvious to everyone on this seminar and everyone who's attending it that the United States has more people in prison for its population size than any other nation in the world. And I think that's a great dishonor to our nation. Check this now. We've gone from 300,000 people in our prisons in the 1970s to 2.2 million today. This is within all our lifetimes, 300,000 to 2.2 million. There are multiple reasons why this is so, beginning with the war on drugs, where dealers, yes, but the war on drugs gave draconian sentences to mere users. Legislative behavior before the 70s had many, many things that today are criminalized that were not then criminalized. They're nonviolent crimes, including white-collar crimes. We have mandatory sentencing that was part of the war on drugs. And we're doing this with a now polarized society with a tremendous number of haves and a tremendous number of have-nots. Another reason why so many people are in prison is, in my judgment, caused by two things. The plea bargaining system, in which the judge has little or no impact, and in many cases, I'm sorry to say, no interest in the deal bargain between the assistant district attorney and defense counsel. And the fact that our voting population does not investigate a prospective judge's attitude towards sentencing people who commit crimes as a way to make a living or to overcome the defendant's sense of low self-worth and deep frustration. To understand why I have so many people in prison, we need to understand how the plea bargaining process works. Give you an example. A district attorney charges a defendant with a felony. Let's say burglary without use of a weapon and without violence. But the amount stolen and the breaking and entering is sufficient to call it a felony. But the DA determines that the burglary, particularly in Westchester, is not so serious a crime as to find a jury trial as to the defendant's guilt desirable. The defendant either has private criminal defense counsel or most typically is unable to afford his or her lawyer, so the court will appoint a lawyer with legal aid to represent the defendant. A good defense lawyer will quickly plead not guilty and ask for a jury trial as the constitutional right of the defendant. The assistant district attorney assigned to this case and defense counsel come up with a sentence that will prevent a jury trial, as the defendant voluntarily will plead guilty to a lesser offense and will accept a mutually agreeable sentence, usually a limited amount of incarceration. The defendant and his or her defense counsel attend court in a criminal term. And the ADA states, Your Honor, I reached an agreement with defense counsel that the defendant will plead to a Class A misdemeanor and will accept 3 months incarceration and 3 years probation. The judge asks defense counsel if he or she is in agreement, and the counsel says yes. The judge then orders a pre-sentence report from probation that goes into detail regarding the defendant's background, and probation makes a sentence recommendation, usually incarceration, I must say. At a later court date, the judge reviews the pre-sentence report and decides, almost always, to proceed with the plea bargain. The judge then either asks questions of the defendant, and more usually the ADA asks the statutorily required questions of the defendant to assure that the defendant agrees with his or her plea and the sentence. The defendant answers all the questions correctly, as has been prompted, to allow the plea bargain to proceed. The judge just wraps his gavel and says, so ordered, or repeats the plea and then says, so ordered. Now I know for a fact, and I've done it, that you could send a dozen defendants to prison in this manner in less than 30 minutes of final court time. When I first came into this office, I was stunned by the plea bargaining system and by what they created or crafted, that I rejected 6 of them in a row. That got a delegation from the DA's office in White Plains in my law office in Bronxville and showed me the names and shocking criminal records of a handful of serious felons that the DA had to release under the early trial law of New York State because they just couldn't get to the jury trials on time. And they blamed it 100% on me. I was so shocked that I called the head of Office of Court Administration in Albany and described this, and I thought the DA was way out of line in trying to tell me what to do. And the head judge in the Office of Court Administration for all of New York State said, quite frankly, do as the DA wants you to do, period. Result, we judges send people to prison with almost no thought as to the impact on the defendant's life or safety, and we do it in an automated, remote manner. Now, sending people automatically like this to prison does nothing for society of the prisoner. Our Westchester prison has between a 70 and 80% recidivism rate. I've seen people up to 3 times over my years as a judge, in and out, in and out, in and out. And they didn't stop committing burglary in Bronxville. There was no deterrent quality to what they went through. So I reached the point where I felt ethically compelled to either resign and stop my participation in the damage, or to come up with a way that the court could change the defendant's behavior without resort to imprisonment. And we did come up with something. We called it community restorative justice. We used a statutory sentence called a conditional discharge, where the judge gives the defendant a year to fulfill the judge's requirements during the year, at the end of which, if the defendant's done what the defendant was told to do, there's no further punishment, no incarceration, and no probation. Now, obviously, courts don't have the training or education to perform what a social worker, a psychologist, or a therapist can do. But we found an organization in Westchester called TASK that is part of the Westchester County Department of Health. I would send a defendant to TASK for analysis, and I would get a report on what it was in that defendant's background that led to their criminal behavior, and would give me a prescription of therapies and interventions that over a year they felt would change the defendant's behavior. Now, we didn't do many people like that because I did this in my last 2 years as a judge. It did require that we put together a couple of community members to act as volunteers to the court to aid the defendants in going through the restorative justice sentence. The court, defense counsel, the ADA, and the community restorative justice staff and task met with the defendant on a monthly basis in a private meeting before court commenced. The judge would act as a mentor to the defendant, as well as admonish the defendant if he or she wasn't behaving properly. It worked. I mean, it worked wonderfully. Their lives were changed. Their speech changed. Their dress changed. Their attitude changed materially in that 1 year. But sadly, try as I could not get other judges to use this program. I went to a state magistrates conference and gave a pitch for this program to all the officers and directors of the State Magistrates Association, as well as the incoming officers and directors. I'd say half of them walked out on me as I was giving my pitch. And I went up to the incoming president of the State Magistrates Association, and I said, "You obviously didn't appreciate what I said. What was your problem with the restorative justice program?" And he looks at me coldly and he says, "Well, it's either immoral or illegal, and I want no part of it." Boom, off he went. So my conclusion is the courts could, absolutely could, put together programs like I did, which will change people's lives for the better, which will do what sentencing is supposed to do and change behavior. But the judges themselves, for the most part, are not going to do it. It's the political parties that run people for office that need to tell the people who run for office that they want them to do this sort of thing. And it's the constituents, the people who vote for judges, have to get fairly sophisticated about it and demand judges who will change how courts handle criminal sentencing. It's not a simple matter, I'm certainly sure. But until the population and the political parties that run people for office are prepared to demand it of the people who do run for judge, it's not going to happen. And if it's not going to happen, then we have this cookie cutter, so ordered, so ordered, so ordered, everyone off to prison, okay? At a time when we have way too many people in prison, we have way too many matters of criminalized behavior that are fairly recently criminalized, way too many statutory crimes, and way too many compulsions that the judges have as to sentencing. So that's it. That's how I feel about it, and I think we need to do something about it.
That's plenty, my friend. Thank you so much for what was a nice way to walk us through the process. One of the things I was really excited about in doing this presentation is that many of us are not intimately familiar with our court system, right? Unless you've been to prison or you have family, or, so not all of us are familiar with what the process of going through, getting a defense attorney, potentially going to prison. All of this process is somewhat new, and sometimes because you're not intimately involved with it, you kind of think it's not my problem, not my business to really know. And getting people to connect the dots for us is super important for us to remember that these are human beings. These are not just numbers for CompStat metrics, or just numbers for plea bargaining metrics, or just numbers to put in prison beds in order to make profit off of the prison system. These are people's lives. And what you said about restorative justice and figuring out more rehabilitative ways to improve people's lives. We want people to be good members of society. And if prison is not producing those outcomes, we need to be looking for other solutions. And that's really the concept of this moment that we're in, is how do we reflect on our systems? Are they doing what we want them to do? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? And what can we do to make them better? So thank you so much, George. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things you mentioned as far as getting the community involved on, getting on their judges. We got one more presenter, and then we're going to go into some Q&A. So if you haven't already been doing so, please put your questions and comments in the Q&A chat box. I'm okay if they're in the regular chat box, but the Q&A chat box makes life a little easier so they can all be in one place. Last up, we have Dr. Mena Demesi, as we mentioned before, Vice President of Policy Analysis and Research for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. And she spends quite a lot of time trying to delve into how policy affects communities of color. And she's going to kind of give us some more insight into some of the things that our other panelists mentioned and how they are affecting communities in a really real way. So, Dr. Mena.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Norris. Thank you to our really distinguished panelists. I really commend you all for the work that you do, not only representing the law, but doing so in a way that calls attention to the fallibility of the system and the ways in which we need to correct it. I have to put a disclaimer to everybody. I am not a lawyer. I dream of being one one day, but I am a political scientist, and my goal and contribution to this conversation is really to look at these issues not in isolation or in a vacuum, but understand that our court system in its political context evolves out of a democracy and a history that was predicated on discrimination. What you're hearing in terms of the common thread throughout all these remarks we've heard this evening is that socioeconomic status, almost more than anything, defines your outcomes, or at least the probability of your outcomes once you are subjected to the criminal justice system. And when you start to layer race and ethnicity to your socioeconomic status, you can see sort of the triple threat that affects communities of color in particular, and poor people more broadly speaking with the system. And so, we want to understand the evolution of this. Many of you are involved in this work, but there's a lot of education that needs to be done in terms of not only understanding the system at the point of incarceration or at the point of being represented in the court system, but really looking at it from the full life cycle of a human being. We can talk about this issue through the context of education alone and see the deficiencies that set up people for failure. I mean, many of you might know Brian Stevenson at the Equal Justice Initiative, founder, lawyer, big time advocate for reform. And he often will remind us that those who are rich and guilty have a higher chance of beating the system than if you are poor and innocent. And that seems to be time and time again the realities that we face. Even alone when you look at the education system and the ways in which disciplinary action is enforced on young people, particularly Black and Brown communities, you see these statistics. You have to go back to what the data tells us, right? And overwhelmingly, we see, even when it comes to suspensions and expulsions, Black students make up 16% of public school student populations, but 42% of the students who receive multiple suspensions. Is very similar to what you hear about 1 in 3 men, Black men in their lifetime will experience the criminal justice system. Why? Because they're guilty? No, not really. What we're looking at is a system and a history that has set some people up for success, usually based off of resources, political influence, and then systems that are built up to oppress others. And does that mean that we don't have any faith or trust in the system? No. Does it need reform? Yes. What kind of reform does it need? Well, we're witnessing that as we see the unpacking of the murder of George Floyd as a systematic system that is really predicated on some really dangerous rules. You heard about the CompStats. It's very much a real thing. Judge McInnes also talked about the fact that we are 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the prison population. So we really have to ask ourselves, what is the point of our criminal justice system? Is it to right the wrongs? Is the police force's job to protect the safety of its community? Well, what happens when the law enforcement is actually perpetrating the crime? there are some deep-seated flaws. And for anyone who has not seen the documentary 13th and wants to get a quick overview of just how far back our systems go, please watch that. I mean, we are talking about going back to our Civil War amendments with the abolishment of slavery in the 13th Amendment, and the ways in which that transition from abolishing slavery really not only got us, to a better place. Yes, we are happy that the 13th Amendment was passed. We are happy that the 14th Amendment is giving equal protection under the law was passed. We are happy that the 15th Amendment giving Black men the right to vote, and then the 19th Amendment for women. We are happy those things passed. What did it do? It started to chip away at systems of oppression. Did it eradicate it? No, because every time we make progress, we tend to have at the same time forces that will continue to rebirth oppression in new vigorous ways as a response to the law. So what did we see? We saw the birth of the prison industrial complex. We saw the prison system being used as a business to continue servitude under the law. And so when we look at the culmination of our history, yes, we have made tremendous progress, but that's not the point of this conversation. The point of this conversation is because of that progress, we should be in a much better place in terms of fixing our system. We often rely on the courts and the law to be our checks and balances, but we also understand that it has its flaws as well. And that's really where people should be empowered. The art of protest, and I see some of the comments here, someone asked about federal agents being able to, what's the sort of accountability there in terms of their treatment of protesters. I mean, what we see with the 1033 program and all, there has been a concerted effort to militarize the police, less effort on community neighborhood policing. So, we have to investigate that. We also have to understand the politics of the moment. Certain administrations have used their power, that is the executive branch, in ways that support flawed systems and in ways that chip away at it. So when you look at, for instance, the Obama administration's efforts with the 21st Century Policing Task Force, or the creation of the COPS office, community-oriented policing, this was done in a way to resurrect what actually many protesters are calling for when they say defund the police. It sounds scary. It's not just the mere art of getting rid of funding for the police. It's appropriating the money and resources where it can have the most impact in the right way, right? This should be, we need to reevaluate the full life cycle of someone who enters the court system. We have to understand why they're there. I have, plenty of statistics here, but all of them point to one thing, which is that socioeconomic status, or the lack thereof in terms of economic opportunity, in large part defines not guilt, but more your economic status in terms of your interactions with law enforcement. So this brings up a number of efforts that need to be made in terms of reform. It's everything from those of you working on the ban the box sort of fair chance policy, where we're talking about economic justice, restorative justice. That means that when someone comes through the system, you want to make sure that they have the highest probability of re-entry into society. And if we have laws that push back on that, that's problematic. It's counterintuitive. We need to question it. At least now we have about 35 states who have banned the box. That means they're not that employers have been legislated to not ask the question if someone has previously been involved in the criminal justice system. But we still have ways to go. We can unpack the punitive measures of the criminal justice system, everything from the death penalty to solitary confinement, and the ways in which they disproportionately target people with mental illness and exacerbate that. What is the point of our criminal justice system? Again, one of our partnerships we did at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation was with the Annie Casey Foundation. They've been doing this work with their juvenile detention alternative initiatives for close to 30 years. I highly recommend those to to look at the work they're doing, the partnerships with detention facilities across the country, and helping guide them in terms of rehabilitative practices to promote successful reentry for young people. You know, our court system doesn't always get it right, but we need people like the panelists you're hearing, the legal experts you're hearing from today, to really call out injustice where they see it. Not just to hold people culpable, but to make the system better, more efficient, more just. And so, you know, a lot of the work that we're going to need to do is going to be, it's going to be difficult, but it's necessary. I also want to lift up, you know, young people who have been organizing across the country, who are unfortunately often stereotyped as naive and inexperienced. And I always push back against that, because if it weren't for the Black Lives Matter movement and many of you on this call who've been out on the streets, we would not even be talking about this. I mean, go back to you know, the body cams as an effort to push back on this. It's really shined a light on the still extant police brutality we're witnessing. And if it weren't for the young 17-year-old young lady, Denisha Taylor, who used that moment in where George Floyd was fighting for his life for minutes to sacrifice her life. By the way, she's getting a lot of death threats, and she's under duress for standing up in the face of injustice to shine a light on what's been happening for several years, right, several decades. And so we need to be able to ensure we can protect her and the people who protest. That's part of our democracy. And we're seeing a lot of problems in terms of even the art of protest and the ways in which protesters can be protected doing the good work of calling out our system. So we need accountability mechanisms. I can't tell you how many cases from the Rodney King trials till now where, you know, Trayvon Martin, we just don't understand how it is that law enforcement can go through the system and be acquitted or set free when all fingers point to them. So if the very people who are charged with protecting us are those who get off free, there is no incentive for change. That's why the system has to be dismantled. So don't get scared when you hear people talk about defund the police. Interrogate it and ask them what they mean by that. Because if I tell you that part of the mission is to ensure that the community is empowered to keep their people safe, I think you would agree with that that principle. I do, at least. If I were to tell you it's to improve accountability measures to ensure that the people coming through the system are trained in a way to treat everybody fairly, I think you would agree with that. Well, that's essentially what we're talking about. As we know, even in Congress, the budget reflects your priorities. This is a values argument. What kind of institution do we want to be? And then the final thing I'll say is, you know, what about the preventative aspects of this? When you set up a system, as you've heard from my colleagues, when you set up a system to reward police officers who, you know, based on their convictions and incarceration rates, when they get points for you know, their by any means necessary apparatus that they use to charge people and bring them in the system, and then you on the flip side you punish those who try to speak out against the system, you discourage them out of threat and fear that they may not have a job if they call up the system, you have a system set up for failure. And so that's what we're calling out. Let's look at this through multiple lenses, from education to economic justice to incarceration. Let's look at the court system. Let's look at what happens to prevent this whole thing from happening. Let's interrogate and investigate implicit bias and racial bias that we see in the court system, but also in the legal system, in the police system. We need to unpack that so that we can fix the problem. And so let's look at what the data continues to tell us, and let's really unpack how we got to this place, and what is the point of our criminals. Should we rethink and reimagine our systems in light of the way they were designed to be in the first place? So I'll stop there.
Now we got some smart people out here tonight. Thank you, Dr. Mena. for shedding so much light. And I mean, I love some of the things that you wrapped us up with, because, you know, you stated how budgets are moral documents, as MLK said, and it shows our priorities. It shows us where we're willing to invest. And so when people say defund the police, I don't think that they're saying we don't need any form of enforcement of laws. We know that, you know, people break the law, that there are violent offenders. What I think people are trying to say is that we have to put money in the places that we want to grow, right? It's like you make an investment, you invest in the places where you want your money to grow. If all we're trying to grow is our police departments, then we keep doing what we're doing. If we're trying to grow education, if we're trying to reverse poverty, if we're trying to grow equity, we're trying to grow, you know, more economic opportunity and more workforce development, then we need to invest in those areas. And so, you know, I think a lot of what you said there is very valuable. I'm very grateful again to all of the panelists for sharing their viewpoints. And now we get to go into some of the Q&A. I have been taking some of the questions from out of the chat box, so feel free to keep doing so. And I kind of want to lead off with a question that will gear to Tom, but anybody else can also piggyback on some of the back end of it. But it came up a few times, actually. It came up in your presentation, it came up in Eliza's, and then Dr. Mena towards the back end. But socioeconomic status seemingly was the answer. But what do you see as one of the biggest barriers to helping people get fair legal representation? And then also, this question came up in the chat box, and I'll kind of link the two together. Federal agents we see in Portland, right, are now, you know, arresting people and perpetuating all different types of acts of violence against protesters. If those type of things were to come to New York, what would you guys recommend for somebody who needs to defend themselves if they get arrested? What should they do? What would they do? So Tom, I need you to come off of mute before you start talking, and then go ahead and cue that one up. And anyone else who wants to go after, by all means.
So with regard to the biggest barriers to justice is resources, whether it be financial, whether it be time. I mean, like I said in my presentation, at the end of the day, people pay me money to focus on their case, to make them a priority. And because my caseload is typically less than, you know, the average public defender, I have those resources. I don't necessarily pay for my client to get an expert, but to be honest with you, in a lot of cases, an expert would be extremely helpful, right? So if those people have the financial resources to get an expert, then we can go and do that. And my defense is going to be 10 times better. So with regard to your question about the federal officer, that's something that really, it offends me a lot. The stuff that's going on in Portland, it offends me a lot, because as maybe you took from my presentation, the militarization of the police, being like, we feel like we're in a police state, that is something that I think is completely against everything that America is supposed to stand for. And I know that's not necessarily the focus of this particular discussion, but it is so outrageous to think that in America, you go outside and you're protesting. And granted, there are definitely some people who are provocateurs. They want to cause trouble. But that is not, I don't think that's the purpose of why these federal agents are out there right now. I might be getting a little too political. I think it's more because of where we are in terms of, you know, the presidential election. I think that's a huge part of it. But I do believe that there is a segment of the American population that agrees that if you are adverse to them, then you deserve to be thrown in the back of a van by some, you know, jackbooted, masked federal agent, because they don't agree with you. So what's happening right now is definitely political, but I fear that it's a slippery slope, because being in a police state is not what we want to do as Americans, especially because America was foundationally built on anti-tyranny. Yeah. And that's why I said before that I believe so much in the Constitution, because the founding fathers of the United States, they had their flaws. There's no doubt about it. But they were extremely intelligent. And I think the focus of our Constitution and our system of government was really was based on anti-tyranny. So if we're going to allow federal agents to come into our cities and throw people in the back of vans, I really fear what the future is going to hold for us.
Thank you for that response. I love the passion, and that's why I said we have people up here who are genuinely disturbed by injustice. It's not all black and white. It's just wrong is wrong, right is right. And when you see abuse of power and you see people using and imposing power against people who don't have means, resources to defend themselves, it makes for an issue. So Eliza, I kind of pose the same question to you since it's along your lines. What is one of the biggest barriers that you see to people getting fair legal representation? Obviously, you get a lot of people who, don't have all the options in the world. And then same, if you saw this happening here in New York, as far as these federal agents, what would you recommend to somebody who's arrested, or what would you suggest that we do to protect ourselves?
Yeah, so I think these are great questions, and I think Tom did a great job of answering them. But I think as a public defender, when I first started over a decade ago, it was before called case cap legislation came into effect. Essentially, pro bono attorneys had to sue to say that people in New York were not receiving adequate assistance of counsel due to the fact that public defenders were so overworked. So it wasn't that I didn't want to give all of my time and effort to every single one of my cases, but like Thomas was saying, I had over 180 cases at any given time. And so how is it that we can operate in such a way that one person can handle 180 cases, 200 cases at a time? Now, public defenders are some of the most dedicated, incredible people that I've ever had the pleasure of working with and fighting alongside, and they truly believe in the cause. But the problem is that there is so much work to be done. And so I think, but the thing is, what can really fix this, in my opinion, is changing the district attorney, because so many of my clients were coming through on low-level drug offenses, on crimes of poverty, on things that should never have ended up in our criminal legal system to begin with. People who were being charged for really what was a public health crisis. Rikers Island, which is our New York City jail, gives more mental health treatment than any other provider in New York City. I mean, that is an embarrassment. The fact that people who are mentally ill, who have serious mental health issues and who are in the throes of crises are being dealt with by being locked up and incarcerated instead of being given the help that they need. I mean, that is outrageous. And so were public defenders the burden could be lifted off of them to not have to deal with cases such as those. I think that would be, a huge way of dealing with the overworked nature of being a public defender, and then make sure that people were getting the adequate representation that they deserve, each and every person. And as to the I think someone dropped my tweet in the chat, but I actually spoke out about the rogue federal agents that are operating in Portland, which is just such an abomination. I mean, it's just so disturbing to me. Without uniform, without badges, without warrants, as far as we know, just kidnapping US citizens who are peacefully protesting in unmarked vans and driving away with them. And so I kind of put out a statement saying, well, when I take office, after my election next year, when I take office, the statute of limitations on kidnapping won't have run, and I will certainly prosecute any law enforcement officers who overreach. This applies not only to police officers, but to any rogue federal agents, because I think that this is completely unacceptable what they're doing, and really makes us feel like we live in a fascist state.
Awesome, thank you. So I want to piggyback on something that you and I spoke about, Eliza, and then I also want to take the questions over to George. You had educated me about the powers that the district attorney has, right? And these are things that, I'm not intimately familiar with. I watch Law and Order, SVU, and that's where I get a lot of my knowledge maybe about what the ADAs and DAs do. And you had mentioned that some of the plea bargaining and mandatory minimums that we have in place don't allow for the flexibility. So if the DA has set a mandatory minimum, let's say of 20 years for XYZ crime, the ability for somebody to plead that down is very difficult. So if the mandatory minimums or if the sentencings were less, you could plead down to a more favorable. So by starting up so high, it's difficult to get just punishment. Would you be able to speak to that a little bit? And then George, if you could share maybe some thoughts on that. Did I get that right?
Yes, absolutely. And this is why, I say that oftentimes people, like the district attorney that you elect, is the most powerful elected official you maybe don't even know, because the DA makes every decision as to a case. I mean, everything from whether or not a case even gets prosecuted or whether it gets declined to prosecute. They don't even have to go forward with charges. And oftentimes you as citizens don't even know what cases are being brought and not brought, what charges get sought. So whether it's, a felony or a misdemeanor or a violation, whether or not bail is asked for, everything from whether a case gets diverted, whether someone has the opportunity for treatment, for treatment for drug issues or mental health issues, or whether, a serious sentence gets sought, how many years in prison, and whether a plea gets offered. And so the DA has so much power to make all of these prosecuting decisions. And the decision that's made at the very beginning of a case oftentimes determines the outcome of the case down the road. I mean, I'm sure everyone at this, on this panel has heard of what's called like a trial penalty. People, I've seen clients say, I want to take this case to trial, or I want to take it to hearings. I want to say that my constitutional rights were violated, that I was searched illegally. I was searched because of the neighborhood I live in, because of the color of my skin, because a police officer just thought I looked like a person who might be whatever. And we want to challenge that search. Well, before, somebody might be being offered a non-jail sentence, probation, something else. But if we do the hearing, challenging the illegal stop and seizure of my client, if we just do the hearing, well, after the hearing, it's 2 years in prison. Oh, and you know what? If you then take it to trial, after trial, it's 5 years. So it's what it is it's so coercive, and the DA's office leverages these coercive, charges that they know that a judge would offer. Like George was saying, the judge's hands are tied, and the judge has no ability to undercut the DA's office because of legislative, mandatory minimums. And so when these offers aren't made, and these huge repercussions could take place, and could spend a decade in prison if they don't take a plea, of course people are coerced into taking pleas. So, when the DA can make decisions and say, and put out promises and say, listen, I will never, up someone's sentence because they decide to exercise their right to challenge the constitutionality of the search in their case. That is a huge deal. That will really make a difference in the lives of so many people.
Wow, thank you. And George, if you don't mind coming off of mute and sharing, some of your thoughts.
Sure. I mean, I completely agree as an experienced judge that the DA in criminal matters is dominant. And I always felt as a judge, after basically I was told to shut up and do what the DA told by the head judge of New York State that supervises all judges. And by the way, the DA at the time was Janine Pirro. And she sent a message to me through her minions that if you don't do as I tell you, I'm going to get you in a very disagreeable place in the New York Times, which was then doing exposés on town and village justices. And that really got me. It's so improper and unethical to even say it. And the head judge that I talked to, responsible for supervision of all judges in New York State, said, she's done it. She's ruined several judges. Do what she says. She said, you cannot fight it. So that was my introduction to the criminal justice system. And there's been discussion here about the militarization of the police. I have information on that, hardcore information. As I sat on the bench, I saw these things happening around the country. And I would talk to police department people in Bronxville as to why the police were behaving in so incredible a manner. For instance, I got a hold of a young officer who was only 2 years out of police academy. And I said, look, we just read that this officer was shooting at somebody running from me, and he emptied his whole Glock in this guy with 3 or 4 in the back. And I said, I've been in the Army twice as an infantry officer. I'm trained on every kind of weapon, including hand-to-hand. And I know what you can do or can't do with the use of weapons. But what, even in the Army in combat, we're not doing is emptying our weapon at every poor fool who stands in front of us. Okay? And he said, well, we were trained to do that. That if we're in a firefight, the likelihood is if you just wound this guy or gal, shoot him or her in the leg and take him down without taking their life, they'll pull out their own Glock and empty it in your face. You're dead. And don't assume that based on the training we give you with weapons, that 2, 3, 4 years from now, you're going to be just as good as you are now. And many of these criminals, they're better shots than you are. So you got to take them down, empty your weapon, shoot multiple times. They're trained to do that. And I think they're also trained at police academy that when you graduate from police academy, your life is at risk.
Yeah, I think Tom spoke to that earlier.
Yeah. If you want to survive, you have to be strong and proactive and use deadly force.
Yeah.
Because the bad guys are going to use deadly force against you.
Yeah.
So my conclusion, you, Dwayne, and I have discussed this in the past. One of the solutions here is police academy. I strongly feel that our policemen, at least in New York, and I suspect plenty of other states too, are being militarized by what they're taught as young men and young women at police academy. And they come out kind of scared. Bronxville hires people who have had just a couple of years experience in New York City after police academy. And they usually stay here for their whole career. Well, they come in here looking like Rambo. They've got all this equipment on all the way around their waist. And they're coming into a community where there just isn't any violence and you never have to pull a gun in 40 years. That's how they're trained. They're doing what they're trained to do. So
Yeah.
I strongly think we as citizens need to do something about police academy and think it through.
I agree.
If I could just add something to that, just because I think it's extremely important. It's not just police culture because of militarization, but I think the militarization also encourages the worst kind of person to want to become a police officer. Yeah. So when they see, oh my God, my local police force has a grenade launcher. Look at the armored vehicle that we get to drive. You got a person that wants to do that as opposed to protect the community, because protect and serve doesn't mean pointing a grenade launcher at, a person trying to protest in the middle of the street. That's the issue.
Yeah.
That's the issue. You have the kind of people that are police officers are really the worst kind of people. And I hate to sound like I'm anti-police. I'm just anti-idiot. And there's a lot of idiots who are police.
All right, brother. Speak, man. I appreciate that.
So real. Let me just say too that, I think I really appreciate this space because people have taken these critiques so personally that we cannot unpack and critique the system. And that's exactly right what Thomas is saying is how are the systems set up? What are rewards and incentives for doing good work? And good work is being seen as using your power to oppress others instead of protecting them. And I think we need to unpack that. You have a lot of folks looking at this. We have data for decades on this stuff. You can look at Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt's work at Stanford, social psychologist who's been looking at racial bias training in police for God knows how long, and has actually used her work to turn it into training modules where you really have a significant proportion. Intentionality, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's your actions, right? You can have all the best of intentions wanting to sign up to be a cop, but if you are drawn to it for the wrong reason and you're acting out on that, you might not be the person for the job. So that's my question is and also seeing the reaction of police officers across the country start movements to suggest that we're talking about them or denying the fact that there's a system. We need to unpack it, and the data that Jennifer Eberhardt's been working on has actually been showing. They literally, many people that are in the system feel empowered, but they come to this. There's not enough training there to unpack why they want to be there. Are they mentally healthy and ready to do the work? Do they see certain people as a threat? And do they come to the job with the right to protect and serve, or to oppress and kill?
Thank you.
I can add to that too. I think that there's something that's like the next level to take it to the next level, which is that then after they've already been there oppressing and brutalizing and terrorizing communities in our cities, they are then getting protected. They are not getting held accountable for those actions. And the district attorney is not prosecuting them, because, we see that in New York, that district attorneys take money from police unions and then they protect bad police officers. And the police are part of this criminal punishment bureaucracy that perpetuates systemic racism and injustice. And so a district attorney who is uncompromised and is going to hold police officers accountable for their actions is another critical element of this, because right now the police are not only not being held accountable, but they know they won't be held accountable. And not just for the brutalization, but also for what Thomas mentioned earlier, which is test-lying. There are police who routinely come into court. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. And then you know what? They get on the stand and they tell lies. And then they get to do it over and over and over because the district attorney does nothing and allows that cop's testimony to be the sole reason that a person gets sent to prison, gets deprived of their liberty, their family gets torn apart because of a testimony that's untruthful. So, as DA, I would have a no-call list. There should be cops that are just simply not permitted to testify to send someone to jail or prison, because there has to be oversight. There has to be increased civilian oversight. All of this has to be dealt with in a way that not only says police are going to be held accountable, but have them understand and know that there will be accountability for their actions.
Thank you. Just a quick note to our audience. We said 8:30, but we kind of fibbed. We're actually going to be extending this conversation until 9. If any of you need to drop at 8:30, by all means, but we're going to continue the conversation, and I will continue to take questions from the chat box. One of them actually asked about discovery, and this is something that Tom and I had a conversation about, which I want to allow him to weigh in on. As somebody who defends people, right, he has to go and do investigative work. He has to go and get facts and material evidence and all that good stuff. When you don't have representation, right, you are usually meant to make a decision based on what you know. What is it that the prosecutors are sometimes doing when it comes to discovery that is kind of coercing people into plea bargaining without all the facts? So if I'm somebody who's arrested on a crime, how am I supposed to defend myself if I don't know the evidence or the information that the prosecutors have against me? Could you speak a little bit to that?
Right. So one thing, because I practice law in 2 states, which are close in, geographically, but I think the criminal justice systems are somewhat diverse. I saw 2 different worlds, really. When I started working in New Jersey, it was open discovery, meaning you go and you're indicted, and after you're indicted, there's a statute that says you are entitled to whatever the prosecutor's office has, right? It's helpful because you now have all the information, at least all the information that they say that they're giving you that they have, if that makes any sense. Meaning that sometimes they'll hide evidence, and that's when you really have some POS prosecutors, but that's a different story. What I'm trying to say is that you got this open discovery, and you sit down with the client, you say, hey, look, this is what's going to be presented at trial. Are you willing to take the chance to go to trial when this is the evidence? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Conversely, in New York, until January, the DA's office would give you pretty much nothing. You get a couple of reports, which are really super, super vague, just not substantive whatsoever. I had a case where they redacted phone records, which would have been extremely helpful in us tracking down witnesses, potentially exculpatory witnesses. And the DA really, in my opinion, did it without any just cause, redacted everything. So we fought here in Manhattan. We tried to get those phone records unredacted. And unfortunately, the judge, all she did was co-sign what the DA was doing. We got a different DA, and that DA said, oh, I would have given it to you. So there wasn't a system in New York that said, you're going to get everything or you're going to get nothing, right? It was whatever the particular DA decided to give you. And if you don't have all the evidence that's going to be presented against you, it is impossible to make an informed decision. Right. When you take a plea, and I think the judge, can speak to this, when you take a plea, it has to be knowingly and voluntarily, right? Taken. So if you don't have all the information that could potentially be used against you, how in the world can you make a knowing and voluntary decision that will affect your future forever? Right. Luckily, New York has changed that to some extent because, for example, witness statements. Some witness statements you wouldn't even get until after the DA's office already did their opening statement. You have, a day or two to prepare. Right. For the testimony that could be devastating to your case. How are you not going to tell me what this person said about me? You understand? Or what evidence this person is going to provide at trial? How am I going to wait to the day after the DA's office has already given their opening statement? A jury has been impaneled. And now I'm supposed to make a decision? You understand? But the decision has already been made. You're in trial.
Yeah. So this is what I wanted to kind of highlight is that I think it's Eliza George will probably tell me, but it's 95% of cases right now are plea bargain. Is that accurate, Eliza? So if 95% of cases are plea bargain, that means they're not going to trial. They're being
overwhelming majority.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. And I've worried about this for my whole life on the bench. Is there out there a better system than our current plea bargaining system? I didn't find it. I did not find it. Okay, do any of the panelists here think that there's a better way of doing it than the plea bargaining system?
Well, that's awesome. That's one of the things we're going to get into next is solutions. So by all means, Tom.
I don't think, no, I agree that there is no better system, but there needs to be checks and balances. I have a case right now, active, pending. I have the police dead to rights. The detectives, it's a drug investigation. I have 100%, I think that if all things being equal, I will win a motion to suppress. There's no doubt in my mind. However, right, I am not just content, and Eliza touched on this before. It's the DA has so much control over how it happens, and you do get a trial penalty. So my client is right now, they know I'm going to kick their ass, right? So, and I have the police really dead to rights doing some shady stuff, okay? And I haven't told them about that yet.
My legal advice then would be to not talk about it in a public forum.
No, I'm not. No. I'm not getting into any details. Believe me. The point is that I can right now resolve the case for, probation, non-custodial sentence, right? But unfortunately, well, not for unfortunately, my client is really, there's a decision that has to be made, right? Do I take the conviction, or do I take my chances with a judge who may or may not see it my way, even though objectively I should win? You understand?
Yeah.
So so you're stuck in a catch-22, and that's the problem, I think, with trial penalties and the plea bargaining system.
Yeah. So if you were to say what improvements could be made to the system there, Eliza, to Judge's point.
So I think that the improvements that can be made are things like what we're seeing, with the election of real progressive DAs, not people who call themselves progressive, but true reformer DAs. I think, like, I would point to Rachel Rollins in Boston. She's in Suffolk County, Boston, and she has put together a list of charges that she will just simply decline to prosecute, things she's just not going to prosecute. And so that means she's saying either the case should be outright dismissed prior to arraignment, or, where appropriate, diverted and treated as a civil infraction for which community service is satisfactory, restitution is satisfactory, or engagement with a community-based no-cost programming, job training, or schooling is satisfactory. And so, this is really to address, like, what I think a lot of these major issues that we're all facing, that we're talking about, which are the majority of crimes that are being prosecuted. So yes, the majority of cases are resulting in pleas, but the majority of crimes that are being prosecuted are minor offenses, things that are overwhelmingly crimes of poverty, mental illness, and addiction. And so by saying these are the cases we're not going to prosecute, the avenue for prosecuting misdemeanors when necessary will be overseen, et cetera. But for the most part, that those are things that should just not be brought through our criminal legal system to begin with, I think, is the way that we should be addressing these offenses.
Nice. Go ahead.
There's, I think, kind of an elephant in the room right now that I've worried about for a long time. The district attorney, with this immense power, must be a person that has an ethical complex and a desire to be fair and reasonable. Okay? Without that, you can cause harm. And it's clear as a bell, for instance, that in White Plains in the past, certainly under Janine Pirro, for sure, the ADAs were judged on how many trials they won and how many settlements they got with imprisonment. And I know I've talked to a few ADAs that covered my court, and they were a little nervous about the restorative justice program because they thought it might harm their career to participate in it. That raises moral issues. It's not training, it's moral.
Exactly.
Somebody here asked a question.
Success. In the Manhattan DA's office, you're rewarded for getting conviction.
Getting convictions. Yeah.
Somebody here asked a couple of questions. When you go through the restorative justice program, let's say that that's an option that we deem as more suitable, right, than our current methodology. Do you still get something on your criminal record as your record?
The answer is
yes. You
yes.
still do. And do you potentially lose benefits like housing? You lose rights of voting. Is that still something that is negatively impacting you, even if you go that route as opposed to traditional incarceration?
Well, the conditional discharge doesn't discharge you from the original charge. Okay. However, the assistant district attorney that helped me, together with legal aid, put together this program.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, made it crystal clear that he would fully participate in it, and that if a person didn't wish, you have a choice as a defendant whether you want to go through this program. You have 1 year of work, a lot of things you have to do.
Right.
Okay, and there are people who would rather take 3 months than a year of this kind of thing. And he made it crystal clear, if they don't want to do it, then I'm going to ask for a serious sentence. And they're worse off in not doing it than if they did it.
Yeah.
So I found no disadvantage to a person in going through this, particularly because the same ADA was really into the restorative justice program and the moral aspects of it. And twice in a row, he dropped at the end of the year. The performance had been so outstanding. He dropped under a misdemeanor to an offense voluntarily. Okay? So if you're dealing with people who have a moral sensibility and are trying to be fair and reasonable and trying to cure somebody rather than damn near kill them in prison, it will work out. It can be done.
Yeah. Dr. Mena, what are some of the opportunities that you see for change and for opportunities where we can actually have impact on the system as we know it and really kind of move the needle?
Yeah, I appreciate everyone's comments too. I mean, this is really important to highlight the power of the DA, and also, you know, how do we look at the system more broadly? What are small wins? I mean, there is a blueprint for change. I mean, everything from you know, felon disenfranchisement and reversing those roles to you know, having a more rehabilitative focus on folks who are incarcerated are some options we have. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, we're hearing a lot also about the, you know, pretrial process where, you know, some 80 to 90% of low-income Americans don't have, will end up, you know, being penalized in terms of, you know, fair representation. So when we talk about like indigent defense, as Eliza was talking about, you know, are there opportunities to provide more resources for indigent defense, for public defenders? You know, they have to be set up for success as well. You know, I think there is some variance in terms of states. I think we need to move to systems. It's great to hear the individuals that are in the DA position that have used their power for better. But I do struggle with
relying on one person.
Well, and also understanding kind of the accountability. So what happens? So great if you are Eliza, for instance, and we should all be prepared to campaign for her when she runs for DA in the state of New York. But you know, how do we turn, you know, those opportunities into systems change? And it really comes down to accountability. It's not an easy process. I'm seeing chat feeds around the job requirements for becoming a police officer. You know, what is driving them? I mean, I think we need to look at that. We need to look at, you know, part of this, even if we look at, we need to disaggregate violent crimes from nonviolent crimes. I mean, if you look at the war on drugs alone and the ways in which the prison industrial complex has been exacerbated in terms of number, you know, we see a lot of problems that a lot of powerful people are realizing have created and exacerbated the system. We need to also unpack that as well and really interrogate preventative measures, but also accountability mechanisms. So, you know, there is a lot that can be done. The other part is that, you know, people have to be willing to change. And what, you know, a lot of us on this call, that's the first step, and we're kind of preaching to the choir. So, you know, when it comes to accountability, we also have to protect the art of protest, the art of pushing social movements, because those are the outlets for change, to hold our elected officials accountable, to be active at a local, state and federal level. But, you know, we have to look at this not in a silo, but understand that everything matters, from racial bias in jury selection to support of public defenders, to have the adequate time to provide quality representation to low-income Americans. We have to look at the plea bargaining process. If that's the best process out there, we still have problems with it because there are disparities in terms of it being equally implemented. We have to analyze mental illness and really, hold people accountable. You have to incentivize good public service, and you can't incentivize poor public service contingent upon some of the things we heard today. So what I'm saying to you in large part is that there is actually a rational explanation for the outrage we see, because there's a rational explanation for the numbers that we see. This all didn't just happen out of a happenstance. This is part of the system that was designed this way, right? So that's the piece. So everything, we can't also minimize the small versus big wins. It all counts. So if you are a former felon in the state of Florida or one of the 35 states, that allows you to reenter society and get a job upon incarceration, that's a win. If you can vote while you're in prison, that's a small win. Does it solve everything? No, but I think we need to have accountability, and we need to have it at every level in terms of administrative backing from a policy and procedural standpoint.
Thank you for that. I know that there's a lot of different initiatives that people are advocating for, and I know the First Step Act passed recently. One of the things I know that's being pushed heavily here in New York is bail reform, and we hear a lot about bail reform. Could you give a little bit of insight on why people might want to advocate and really push for proper bail reform, especially on cash bail? I know, Eliza, one of the issues that we always find out is that most poor people don't have cash, and if you put them on $1,000 cash bail and they can't come up with the money, they sit on Rikers Island or they sit in some form of holding cell until they come up with that money. How can we rectify that? What kind of legislation is being out there that people can advocate for or better understand to really have impact there? Because we're really criminalizing people before they've actually been tried.
Absolutely. And I talked a little bit about that in my remarks earlier, but basically we only have a presumption of innocence for those who are wealthy enough to afford to buy their freedom. And I think, we've seen it time and time again in New York, and people say, oh, but are we going to let out people who've committed serious crimes? We do it every day. I mean, if you think about, like, Harvey Weinstein was charged with a sexual offense that carried a life sentence on the back end. And yet he was able to walk into court, get arraigned, post his prearranged bail of a $1 million bond, which is a 50th of his net worth, and walk out of court. Harvey Weinstein did not spend one night incarcerated until after he was proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt and found guilty by a unanimous jury of 12. And meanwhile, I have clients who are sitting on Rikers Island for days, weeks, months, years, waiting for their day in court because they can't afford to pay nominal bail, what most people would think of as not that much, a few $100. I mean, most people are familiar with the pretty well-known case of Khalif Browder, a teenage kid who was accused of stealing a backpack. And he sat at Rikers Island on, I think, a few $1,000s bail, $3,000 bail, and his family couldn't afford to pay it. He was in solitary confinement for 2 of those years. And ultimately that case got dismissed. The DA's office didn't have the evidence. And as Thomas talked about, discovery doesn't happen until the day of trial. Nothing was turned over. So, his lawyer didn't know, no one knew. And Khalif, was finally released and ended up taking his own life. We know the story of Layleen Polanco, a trans woman who was incarcerated at Rikers Island for $500. And she died while incarcerated. And bail reform, New York finally passed legislation on bail reform to update a set of pretrial laws that had been pretty much untouched since the early 1970s. And these laws went into effect in January 2020. And they were met with criticism from a variety of groups who, already have been able to claw back that reform. But I think that the reform kind of doesn't go far enough in terms of, what we need to ensure that we are free of bias based on race and poverty. And so I think that, I've advocated for a long time that we just need to end all forms of wealth-based detention. We should not be incarcerating people based on how much money they have in their bank account. The reality is cash bail, money bail is supposed to be to ensure someone's return to court, and that is not at all how it's being used. And so, it's really important that we end cash bail.
Yep. I think that's something that people should start looking into and research how you can get involved in that issue, because it is criminalizing poor people, right? We are making them criminals or guilty before they've had a chance to go to trial. And so very, very, very important. As I said, we're going to close up here a little bit with actionable steps. Somebody put in the chat actually a question that I had asked the panel earlier. If you're looking to vote for a DA, if you're looking to vote for a judge, right? These are important local elections that we know we need to get involved on. Where do we find information? How do I know if that judge has a good voting record? How do I know if that DA is really going to be, gung-ho for the things that I care about? So I would start with Mena and work our way around. I know nobody has the perfect answer, but let's keep it like a minute and say, if I'm trying to find a way to get involved on my local elections, where should I start?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, a lot of it's going to take, some organizations are out there doing this work. There are a lot of them in terms of everything from ACLU to national and local legal organizations that they are keeping track of decision making, but it's going to be harder to get that information. You have to pretty much meet them halfway. It is important, just like we say, you got to know your mayor and your senator. It's more nuanced when you're talking about your superintendent for your school system, or the DA, or whatever judge is being running in your district. So you do need to do more work and really think about organizations that are that have insight. So you can, it's already compiled somewhere, but it's going to be harder to get to.
Based on where you live, it might be different, right? So it's not like one national database that has all this information. It is local. They're local races. So you got to really connect with your local community and see who's doing the information to categorize and keep that data. Tom, and then we'll go to Eliza. Do you have any thoughts that you'd like to say? Get off of mute, and on how people can get engaged in some of their local politics on these type of issues.
I mean, it is difficult. I know we talked about this when we had they had the discussion amongst ourselves. Frankly, I don't, it's not even something I'm engaged in, and I probably should be. It really is. I'm almost at the mercy of whomever is on the bench, whomever is obviously, we make the decisions. And I think that it is important to vote for, to have the ability to vote for the district attorney, your judges. But I also feel that there is a level of disengagement, and I'm definitely, I am
guilty of it.
Yeah, I am. I'm guilty of it. I hate to use the word guilty as a defense attorney.
Fair enough. I think our culture does that. We focus on the 4-year elections. We focus on the big races, the president, the Congress, and we minimize localized politics. So I don't think that's a you thing. I think that's a cultural thing. So looking to reverse that trend is part of why these conversations matter, because I learned what the DA power was. It's not something that I feel like we put a lot of emphasis on. So Eliza, again, how do people get involved in local actions related to this issue?
Well, I would say, first of all, this is so critical, and it feels as though we're a little bit preaching to the choir, because anyone who's here tonight obviously is engaged. And so we're so grateful, that we're talking about these important issues. And thank you so much. But I really think that go attend all these forums, especially now that they're on Zoom. Like, just go to all the things. There are forums happening, there are debates happening. And also, especially with your DA, it is so important that you engage with them, that you ask them the hard questions, that you go to local Democratic Club meetings and ask them the tough questions, because that person stands up every single day in court and says, on behalf of the people of the state of New York. And so they are acting in your name. They are acting on your behalf, but in your name. So if you don't approve of the things that they're doing, then vote them out. It matters. Your vote matters. You have to use your voice. Not all Democrats are created equal. You know, you have to make sure that people standing there and acting in your name are acting in a way that you think is just, that you agree with their moral compass, that you think that they are an ethical person who cares about people, and that's who you want representing you. And so it matters. Like, get involved and get invested. And thank you for being here and for giving me this opportunity.
I mean, nobody can fault you for not using your voice. That is not something anybody can ever say. You use it with force and power and vigor, and we appreciate it. George.
Well, okay, it's a political issue. To become nominated by a political party to run for office, you are nominated by a political party. You can go in as an independent, but that's extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And so since most people who are elected are not elected as independents, although I might add, the last time I ran, I was so sick of the system, I ran only as an independent.
Yep.
And I got more votes as an independent than others for trustee and mayor and so on who are running as a political party.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's a big problem because most people have no clue where the power is in a political party in their jurisdiction. Technically, it's with what is called the party's committee. In Bronxville, there's a Republican committee and there's a Democratic committee. They're official.
Right.
Okay. They determine who runs for office locally under that party. They determine it. Okay. And if you want to have influence on who they run for office, you've got to contact them. You've got to know one or two of them. Mm-hmm. Find out who they are and tell them what you want and what you think is appropriate and ethical in the kind of person that you want to run for office through that party. You have to use the political process, in my judgment.
Yeah, I'll just add to also in the name of Congressman Lewis, to Judge McInnes's point, is you got to get in good and necessary trouble. And part of that is also going to your elected officials and asking them what they think about these DAs, right? And putting them in the hot seat. I mean, we witnessed what happened to Senator Klobuchar in the state of Minnesota, right? I mean, up until George Floyd's murder, she was a viable candidate. And the reality is, because of one decision and interaction where she had an opportunity to hold this police officer accountable, she didn't. And so your track record follows you. And that's the piece, is that, you have to hold everybody accountable. So the question is not just to that person who's DA, but to everybody. Force them to speak out either in favor or opposition, so you know where they stand. And then if you need to have a campaign against or for them as well.
Yeah.
Perfect. I got to wrap, George. I know you got some more on it, but we got to do some closing remarks. So first and foremost, I just want to say thank you to all of you amazing panelists for sharing so much knowledge within each of you that, it's a lot to dissect. And there's so many different moving parts to our criminal justice system as we know it, right? There's policing, which is kind of the first engagement that most people have with the system, right? Those are people that arrest them and put them in the holding cell. Then you have that process where if you don't have bail money, you can't get out and you can't get, the fair treatment. Or then you go into, some form of a plea bargaining process. You go into some form of court system where then you get sentenced. You go into the prisons. So there's so many different components, and we didn't get to touch on all of it, but I think we did a pretty good job of laying some form of foundation for what will be future conversations. This is not the last that we hope to have on this topic. What I wanted to kind of do was tie it up in a little bit of some of the things that we talked about that people can do as ways to be involved and as things that we know are important. So knowing your local elected officials, judges, DAs, assembly persons, those individuals, knowing who they are and what they stand for is important. And those platforms are available on their websites, obviously, if they have them. And then if not, there's local groups that compile this information for you to get more information. At the end of this, those of you that signed up will get a link to some resources. And there's ways that you can actually contact your local officials from your phone. There's something called ResistBot, where you can literally text a message to our mayor, to our president, to your assembly people from your phone, 2 minutes. And this is the power of technology, where we can now advocate for the things that we care about. So if you care about bail reform, and that was something that you heard that is important, then you can advocate for that by sending out monthly, weekly, daily, if you want to, messages to our elected officials saying, this is the policy that I want you guys to enact on our behalf. So being involved and engaged, super important. Advocating for things like a restorative justice program in your local courts, right? So going to your court system and saying, these are the things that we think are important, and we want to make sure that people have chances for rehabilitation, not just more sentencing, because we know more sentencing leads to more recidivism, that people are just going back. 3 out of 5 people who get released from prison are going back within just a few years, and that's not a system that is sustainable. It means that what's happening in those prisons is not actually benefiting and creating fair or safer outcomes. Another thing that we can do is advocate for public defenders, for them to have more money. If they had more money and more resources, they could hire more, they could have more time to try cases and not have 180 cases per person, right? That's absurd. There's nobody that can handle that level of caseload and do a fair job to every single one of their folks. And there's actually an organization called Gideon's Passage that talks about, if you have 200, you might have to just focus on the 50 that you believe are the ones that you can actually have an impact on. And sadly, the other 150 have to get kicked to the wayside. And not that you don't care about all 200, but it's an impossible task to spread yourself that thin. And so he has created a process around that. But we can advocate for more money for our public defenders, because they protect the poor. We can get better acquainted with our DA and these approaches. So I think that there was quite a bit that was said tonight in terms of understanding where you can fit into the picture. And also, one of the things that I saw in another panel from a person who was formerly incarcerated said that if you can, no problem, Eliza, thank you so much. One of the people said that if you can go to the prisons and actually engage, that if they can see people from the outside world coming in and connecting with them, whether it's workforce development programs or reading to them or teaching them new skills, that actually connects them to the outside world in a very important way that reminds them that this thing is bigger than just what they're experiencing in and behind those bars. And so, as I will say, there's a lot that's there for us to be able to do to start having impact and humanizing the people that we have been locking up for so long. And I really want to say again, thank you to everyone who participated in this panel discussion. All of our speakers, amazing. All of our audience members, thank you. I know there was 100 and something at different points, maybe up to 200 at times, give and take. And I think that's amazing to have for a discussion of this kind, because it's not one that we have all the time in our general public discourse. It's usually just a handful of really activist people in this space. Thank you to all of our partners. Again, my business partner, Alejandro Alvarez, amazing person, my best friend at Soulful Synergy. Lily, our business development manager, the team that really helped me, get everything prepared for this. Dean and the rest of the club at the Rotary Club of Harlem, amazing. They always let me do crazy ideas that I have and bring them to light. And so thank you for letting me, host this panel on behalf of our club. Mary, our district governor for District 7230. Amazing to work with her for as many years as I have. And George McGinnis, who will be her predecessor, or other way around, but he'll be taking over for her when she finishes this year. Amazing support that we have at the district, and Cecily Smith for allowing me to use her Zoom webinar to host this discussion tonight. And so, without all of the different players involved, this would have not been as promising and as amazing a conversation as I think it was. I'll have to watch it back on replay to see exactly how good it was, but it felt good to be in it. I learned a lot. It was authentic. It was genuine. And I'm very grateful for all of you.
Thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
guys.
Keep up the good work. Eliza for DA, all the way.
Here, here.
So, Rotary does not make any endorsements.
Okay, sorry, I do in my individual capacity.
But I would not disagree with that statement. With that said, amazing job by all of you. Thank you to everybody who participated and stayed the full 2 hours with us. And this will be available on some form of playback. It'll be here on Facebook, but as well, we'll get you guys a recording if you want to share it more widely, because I think there was a lot of gems in this conversation. So, wow, amazing. Follow us on social media. Follow us on social media. Rotary Club of Harlem, Rotary Club of Bronxville, and soulful synergy. Follow us on social media. We love y'all.
Thank you.
Take care, guys. Bye.
Signing off.
Thank you.